Our speaker today is Jim Lorenz. He has been a pastor here in Northern California Conference for 23 years. The last church that he was pastoring at was Pleasant Hill before he became the ministry coordinator for the Northern California Conference. His wife Julie works at the conference. She works in the communications department, and anything you see about the conference in the recorder that you all should be getting, she put together. That's what she does. And they have 2 teenage children, a boy and a girl. Some of you may think that he looks familiar. He was last here, not this Christmas, but the one before, when he was one of the Magi that told about being there at Christ's birth. So he will be familiar to you. And the title of his message is Sabbath Nuach. Jim.
It's good to be here and not in costume. But it's also nice to be able to come to a church that's closer to my home. I was telling Sylvia that I think the last church I was at was Wairika. And that is a little bit more of a drive. So it was nice to come this way, except I will say the rainstorm was coming with me. So coming over Altamont Pass this morning, there was a creek going across the road. And I will say at highway speeds, that does provide for a moment of excitement. But yes, ministerial director, some of you are not familiar with the term. It's basically, I am a pastor to the pastors. Because, somebody needs to be looking out after them. They are human after all. And so I help them with their continuing education, training. So I've been working with your pastor as he's been working on his doctorate. And also, if a pastor ends up in crisis or something's going on, I would be reaching out to them as well. And so those are just some of the things I do as ministerial director. A lot of people are not familiar with that. And I will say, your pastor getting to go to Israel is a huge thing. I'm just curious, how many have been to Israel? Just to see a couple of hands, yeah. I would liken it to when you read your Bible, it's like black and white TV to color high-def TV. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah, when you can see, you open up your Bible and you can say, okay, I have been there. I've seen that. It just changes your outlook on the Bible. And so I think when Pastor Tyler comes back, and he's going to be looking at his Bible differently. I guarantee you that. And you'll probably hear that in his sermons and stuff. So I'm really glad he got to go. And I think he had already signed up before we announced that we were going to be taking the Northern California pastors over to Israel. And so I think he's regretting that, but he's on a really good tour right now himself. And so you're going to be blessed by his going over there and coming back and sharing. I know that much. Let's see, do we have the slides? There we go. The story I'm about to tell you is true, and it takes place in a part of the world where the pastors' wives, it is common for them to have a choir. In fact, there is something of a competition between the various pastors' wives as to even who has the best choir. Now, this particular pastor's wife and her choir are traveling on Sabbath. I don't know exactly if they were doing a church service, an evening concert. All I know is they're traveling. And, after you travel for a while, you need to make a pit stop. And so they had decided to stop this one place. And as she's walking back to the bathroom through this gift shop, she sees something that she really, 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 really wants. Her challenge, though, is this. It's Sabbath. So she's not going to be by this way anytime soon again. And so she's trying to figure out, how does she get something and not buy something on the Sabbath? And so she prays about it. And then she believes that God gives her the answer to her dilemma. She just took it. Therefore, avoiding not having to buy on the Sabbath. Now you laugh. I think she missed something else there with thou shalt not steal. But anyways, I wish I could say that this misguided pastor's wife is an outlier. An extreme example of somebody who really doesn't understand everything she should about the Sabbath and everything else. I wish I could say that. My fear is that there are likely people here today who have a similar outlook as she did. Not that you're going to go out and steal stuff on Sabbath. I'm not saying that. But an understanding of the Sabbath is as rudimentary as hers was. And that's what my fear is. What I mean by this? See, here's one of the big challenges we have as a church. If you have sat through an evangelistic series, then you know what I'm talking about. We will often present the Sabbath. In fact, we'll oftentimes, if it's a traditional series, evangelistic series, there'll oftentimes be a couple of days spent on the Sabbath. Like, how did we get the Sabbath? Why isn't the rest of Christianity keeping the Sabbath like they used to? But here's the challenge with that. We do very little than to tell you, once you understand what day is the Sabbath, we don't tell you what to do with the Sabbath. It's kind of like a dog catching a car. Dogs love to chase cars, but what are they ever going to do with that car once they catch it? And we do that all the time as a church. In fact, if you were to go right now to the Adventist Book Center, to the shelves, and look for books on the Sabbath, you would find a number of books telling you what day is the Sabbath. You would find pamphlets on how to share with your Christian brothers and sisters on what day is the Sabbath. What you'll be struggling to find is what to do with the Sabbath. That is an area we're not very good at. And see, what happens with this lack of biblical knowledge then, and information hates a vacuum, we then start filling in the details with tradition. Maybe not so unlike the Jews do. If you've seen Fiddle on the Roof, tradition. We sometimes give the Jews a hard time for maybe we sometimes think they're orthodox, sometimes strange ways. They cannot light a fire on the Sabbath. And so what that means is even turning on a light switch on Sabbath morning, for them would be considered kindling a fire on the Sabbath. And so their light switches, a lot of them will have now the little photo cells, so if you walk by, it'll turn on automatically for you, so they do not have to do that. And do not get into an elevator, a Sabbath elevator in Israel on Sabbath, unless you want to visit every single floor. You only make that mistake once, I will say, from experience. This one young boy stayed home on Sabbath from synagogue. I don't know if he was having a bad day or what, but he was upset. And so he spent that morning rebelling by flicking the light switch on and off. My wife's grandmother had a Jewish neighbor who would go and find a Gentile neighbor to light her oven, turn her oven on, so she could spend the rest of the day baking. And we shake our heads like, okay, I think you're missing something here. But I hate to tell you this, we're no different. We have our traditions too. And that Adventist pastor's wife is an example, an extreme example. But it probably would not take me very long talking with you to find out some rather interesting traditions of what we do with Sabbath. And so this morning I want to spend some time looking at Sabbath. I want to look at it from three different angles, from the Bible, from science, and then let's talk about application of what we're going to be talking about this morning. I want you to open up your Bibles this morning to our passage of study, Hebrews 4:4-6. It was read a few moments ago, but there's this key word in there I want you to see for yourself. And so if you would open your Bibles up with me to Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews, if you're struggling to find it, back in the back of the New Testament, just before you get to Revelation. It's the biggest book before you get to Revelation. And this book is a very interesting book, talking about the seventh day. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words. And on the seventh day, and here's the word I want you to pay attention to. God rested. That word there, rested. From all his work. And again in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. It still remains that some will enter that rest. And those who formerly had the gospel preached to them did not go in because of their disobedience. Keep in mind, Hebrews is written to a Jewish audience, right? The book of Hebrews. And so, while this is in the Greek, he's citing Old Testament. He's citing a Hebrew concept. And so, if we're really going to understand this passage, we have to go back to the Hebrew and understand exactly what was he talking about. The writer of Hebrews, who I believe is Paul. It's this word, nuach. Nuach. Now, we don't have gutturals in the English language. It's one of those things you almost have to spit from the back of your throat. Okay? Don't turn to the person next to you as you're saying it, but I'm going to have you say it out loud, kind of like a hard C, a breathy C. Nuach. Nuach. Okay, nuach. Okay, here's what happens. It means all these different things. It means serenity, peace, rest, tranquility, security, quiet. But if you look carefully, we only have one of those as a verb. We don't say God serened. We don't say God peaced or tranquiled. We don't have those as verbs in English. And so how we translate this word is God rested. God rested. But now you're beginning to get a picture of the fact that this word is much, much bigger than a nap. You know, a lot of times when we translate this passage, it almost sounds like we're talking about, and God took a nap on the seventh day. If we're not careful, we lose the meaning here. Nuach is such a powerful word. And I think if we're really going to start getting a handle on what the Sabbath is about, we have to understand this word. Here's a passage that you're well familiar with, Exodus 20:11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he nuach on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it holy. If you want a really, really good book on the Sabbath, I highly recommend this book by the late Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He talks about nuach, and here's what he's saying about this word. He says, it's a state in which there is no strife, no fear, and no distrust, synonymous with the state of life in the world to come. There in the Pleasant Hill area, they opened up a new crack house. I should rephrase, they call it a micro creamery. It has some of the best ice cream you've ever had, but it's like crack, I got to tell you. You need to keep driving past that place because once you go in, I mean, your willpower starts melting. This place, it is flavors from around the world. I mean, and you're just looking at these different things. I mean, flavors I've never even considered. I take some of my other friends with me who lived in India and go, oh yeah, no, that's a flavor from India. And there's the Philippines, and there's Mexico. I mean, it's just all over these fantastic flavors. And one of my favorites is coconut ice cream. And so the other day they had coconut, and they don't always keep these in stock. And so I got a little spoon of that coconut ice cream. I want to say, okay, is this going to be up to par here? And you get that little taster of coconut ice cream on that spoon, and it just melts on your tongue. You're going, I know what's coming on that cone. A whole cone of that, maybe 2 scoops. You know what's coming. That's what Heschel is saying about Nuach on Sabbath. That our Sabbath is supposed to be a little taste of what is going to be coming with heaven. We here today are supposed to be sampling heaven. Just a little taste of what's going to be coming our way. If a well-meaning Christian friend comes up to you and says, but you know, the Sabbath was done away with, it's now on Sunday. Say, how can you take away my nuach? Because our Sunday-keeping brothers and sisters don't talk about nuach. And maybe that's part of our problem too. We don't talk about it either. I think we have our evangelism backward. We start with telling people, you need to keep this day because the Bible says. I mean, do you ever see any commercial on TV working that way? You need to buy my product because I told you to. That doesn't work. And yet we try to do that with our evangelism. Please do this because I'm telling you to do this. That evangelism may have worked in the past. It no longer works now in our postmodern culture. We need to get smarter about our evangelism. We need to be saying, do you know why you want to keep the Sabbath? Because of nuach. It is the most fantastic thing. You can have the craziest, most awful, no good week. But when Sabbath rolls around with its nuach, I cannot tell you what that does for me. Instead, we often go backwards. We'll tell them, well, the Bible tells you you need to keep this. And if you look in our past, our church's past, we weren't always really good advertisers for the Sabbath either, and how we presented it. Nuach. We tell about the wonderfulness that God has given us. Then we invite them to come and experience this taste for themselves. But here's the challenge. With the exception of a few of the Jews, the writer of Hebrews is telling us they missed it. They missed it. Here's a group of people that were very, very zealous about Sabbath, still are, and Hebrews is saying, but they missed it. And so I got to ask you this question. What makes you think that you've got it? If the Jews missed it, how come you think you have it? See, sometimes we kind of like to portray Sabbath as it's as easy as showing up. You know, Sabbath, of course I kept Sabbath. Of course I experienced rest. The Jews would have said the same thing. So what makes you think you got it? Because the writer of Hebrews says, be careful. They missed it and you could too. It's a warning that we have. Now that we've kind of looked at this biblical framework, I want to switch gears and look at it from the scientific viewpoint. This will not come as a surprise to anybody here. No one in the history of mankind has ever had to live with the number and intensity of stressors we have acting upon us today. And here's the challenge. It's not only adults who are experiencing this, kids are experiencing high levels of stress and anxiety. Some of you maybe just saw this Time magazine, came out here a couple of months ago. They are the post-9/11 generation raised in an era of economic and national insecurity. They've never known a time when terrorism and school shootings weren't the norm. They grew up watching their parents weather a severe recession, and perhaps most importantly, they hit puberty at a time when technology and social media were transforming society. We're the first generation that cannot escape our problems at all, says Faith Ann. We're like little volcanoes. We're getting this constant pressure from our phones. We'll come back to that one, by the way. From our relationships, from the way things are today. Hold this thought for a second. Let me ask you the one question. What is the most important thing for a Christian to do? What's the most important thing for a Christian to do? And this is not a rhetorical question, by the way. I'm soliciting answers. What? Love God with all your heart. Okay. It actually goes beyond that. That's a good start. What's the next? If you love God, then what are you going to be doing? If you do those, that's part of it. That's definitely part of it, but that's not the highest thing, highest form of love. It's not keeping the Sabbath. That's part of the whole thing. Spending time with God, that's part of it. Obey, make disciples, it's all part of it. Okay, I'm going to come back to you. You're Seventh-day Adventists. What's the key issue in Revelation 14 with the three angels? How does it start? Worship. Worship. If you love God, you're going to be worshiping Him. You're going to be obeying Him. You're going to be keeping the Sabbath. You're going to be spending time with Him. And your worship means nothing if you don't have any of those other things happening. Because you can't worship God without loving Him. The key issue in the Garden of Eden, who was Eve going to worship and Adam, is the same issue that is at the end of time. Who are we going to worship? Do we worship God? Or, as the three angels are talking about, do we worship the beast power? It's worship. And here's the challenge. The big challenge that we have. Stress is to worship as kryptonite is to Superman. If you get nothing else, stress is to worship as kryptonite is to Superman. Stress kills worship. See, throughout the history of warfare, history of all warfare, individuals have been trying to come up with stealth technology. The Trojans came up with a horse. And you've had people putting stuff on them to mask themselves, to camouflage themselves ever since and before. And nowadays we just have very sophisticated stealth weapons. Satan's stealth weapon for worship. The key end time issue. The issue that has always been, because if you look at the children of Israel, what were they always struggling to do? Early on was Baal. Worship. And the devil right now has stress. If he can keep us stressed, we can show up at church and he's happy with us because we think we're worshiping. We have a very rudimentary idea of what worship is. If I go to church, I must have worshiped. I hate to tell you this, that's not true. And he's happy if you keep that thought, by the way, that if you have an overly childish view of worship. Because if he can keep you from worshiping, that's what the key issue is. And so stress, I believe, is the devil's greatest stealth weapon right now. Because we bring it to church with us. In fact, a lot of our churches manufacture stress at church. We talked about that in a few moments. And here's the irony. We will get militant over worship. You play the wrong music in some of our churches, oh boy, you're going to hear about it. But the irony is we do nothing about stress because we don't see it coming. We just assume it's just part of the landscape, part of what worship is about. Let me ask you a question. Do you think God actually knew what he was doing when he said Sabbath Nuach? When he gave us Nuach for Sabbath, because the God who created us actually knows how we operate. And he knows if you're going to worship, you're going to have Nuach, an environment of Nuach. This comes from an educational community, but it applies to worship. Making maximum connections in the brain requires a state we describe as relaxed alertness. This is a combination of low threat and high challenge. Relaxed alertness. I mean, we want that for the worship service, Sabbath school, as we're, in Sabbath schools, we're sharing ideas back and forth. I mean, have you ever known somebody who had test anxiety? where they go to take the test, and because they're not relaxed, they're anxious, they cannot remember anything. We want the opposite of that for worship. We've got to have an atmosphere that's relaxed, and yet we want your mind engaged, alert, relaxed alertness. I've got a picture here I'm going to show you. Tell me what you see. What are you seeing? It's a carrier. It's a pilot's view of landing on an aircraft carrier. Do you notice how it's kind of blacked out, the sides? He has very little peripheral vision. They say that a pilot's IQ at that time is about that of a hamster. That's what stress is doing to him. That's why they practice this hundreds of times for muscle memory. They don't want him intellectually thinking, okay, if I apply this pedal and a little bit more stick on this, bring back throttle. No, they don't want you doing that at all. It all has to be automatic. In fact, they say, if you were to ask the pilot his mother's name at this point, he probably could not tell you. He's under that much stress. That's what stress does to you. It just shuts down the brain to where you're just doing motor skills. If you've practiced, if you have the muscle memory. I want to show you another picture here. Here, let's see, do I have the laser? It kind of disappears on the thing. Anyways, on the left, you have somebody who is the baseline, somebody who's at rest. Look at the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe, if you look at the prayer scan, when somebody's worshiping, the frontal lobes are firing. In fact, one researcher calls them the angel lobes. Now, this should not surprise us, because where's the seal of God? Forehead. Where's the mark of the beast? Forehead and hand. I really wonder if it's in the hand and the forehead because we can't rest, because we don't have Nuach. A person has to be at rest to go to a state of worship. If you're stressed, that shuts down what's happening up here. And you're not worshiping. Or if you are worshiping, you're struggling to worship. That's why sometimes when I've been super stressed, I show up at church. One of my prayers, oftentimes I'll pray is, Lord, help me to be present. And if there's something that's going on in my life, some stressful thing happening at that moment, I ask the Holy Spirit to take it away so I can worship. Because I can't have something else interfering in my mind for my worship. Because I need to be there, the one on the right side. Here's what the Pew Research Center says. We have argued in some of our hypotheses that when people engage in these practices in a very deep way, you do two things. First, you are focusing on something, but second, you also screen out irrelevant information. Have you ever tried to focus on something and you have something really stressful going on? Our sister here was talking about this last week. The stuff that she had hitting her. At that moment, it's really, really hard to kind of like relax and go, okay, just here. When you come to church, you're having to push out the world so that you can focus on God. And to the extent that we're able to push out the world is to the extent we're able to worship. Look what David says in Psalm 8:3. When I consider, and that word consider is this deep thinking. That's what that Hebrew word is. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars, which you have made, it's incredible. And see, God wants us to have that relaxed alertness so we can contemplate His awesomeness. See, the God who created us, He knows. He knows us. He knows that if we're going to worship, we need to be in that environment where we can worship. And not just assume that when the church door is open and I wander in, it automatically happens. It doesn't. I want to share with you another word, phases of downshifting. It's kind of like we don't have that many cars anymore that have a standard transmission. But some of you remember those days when you would downshift and you hear the engine high rev. You know what it's like? Okay, when you get stressed, your brain starts downshifting. You're less able to access all those different things. When we downshift, our responses become more automatic and limited. We are less able to access all that we know or see what is really there. Our ability to consider subtle environmental and internal cues is reduced. We seem less able to engage in complex intellectual tasks, those requiring creativity and the ability to engage in open-ended thinking and questioning, which sounds an awful lot like church. That if a person is super stressed, they come in, their ability to worship, as this is telling us, is greatly reduced. They just don't have the mental horsepower because it's going somewhere else. Now, you know this intuitively. Why is it when you are in the shower and you recap something, a conversation, and the best one-liners come back to you and you say, boy, if I had just said this. I mean, you're funny, you're creative. Why is it when you're in the shower that you're that way? Why? Because you're in a relaxed, alert state. The warm water feels good. Your mind is able to start accessing those different things you know. And the opposite thing of why you didn't come up with that great response earlier, maybe because your brain was a little bit downshifted at that moment and you weren't able to fire. It was not firing back as well as you would like. Now, the challenge is we cannot put shower stalls all around the sanctuary. That's just not going to work. But we can do something just about as good. You have a choice on your church atmosphere. That is actually something you have control over. We can't control all the craziness that's going on out there, but we can control what kind of craziness goes on in here. And that's where churches have to start taking some control and saying, you know what? We are going to make sure we have a Nuach environment. That when you walk in those doors, people are going to say, I can't put a finger on it. This place is different. Still trying to figure out what it is, but this place is different. That you can control. One of the ironic moments of history, World War II, Andrei Tupolev, who was one of Stalin's great aircraft designers, he gets put in prison and on trumped up charges, and then he's told to produce, these world-class aircraft designs. Now, I don't know about you, but I cannot imagine a Russian work camp being a very conducive place to giving the best of my brain. We just had some, I'm not even going to go into details, about a mission trip the conference just took. When they came back and they're talking about even the basic commodity situations of life, the bathroom situation and just some of the stuff, you having to wash your hands all the time, just from the environment they were in. I can't think that a Russian work camp is going to be a lot better. And yet Stalin's saying, I want your best. I want your best. And here's the crazy thing. We do this all the time. We do this all the time as a church. One of our big challenges as a church is we do evangelism, we baptize people, and they leave. And I think one of the big reasons they're leaving is because of our non-Nuach environments. A friend of mine is in the general conference, and he was sharing with me. He said, Jim, if we would stop all evangelism, stop it, and just keep our kids, our church would be going much faster than it is now. Much faster. The only reason why our church is growing at all right now is because we have so many people coming in. But you need to understand, we have a ton of people going out. And we've got to stop it. We have to get smarter about our use of resources. Because in my book, we've got to stop fishing with holes in our net. I honestly believe we have some churches that need to stop evangelism. Because remember what Jesus said about some of the Pharisees? They travel across the seas and make these people twice the son of hell. If we're bringing people into a non-Nuach environment, a stressful thing where it's a toxic, unhealthy church, guess what we're doing? We're inoculating them against the church. I'm going to shift gears here. Nehemiah 13:19. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. This is a great text for back then, but very few of us work out in the fields anymore. How do you apply this to 2017? Do we just say, that was good for Nehemiah's time? We just take a black marker and X it out in our Bibles? It makes good for a good historical reading, but as far as application for me, it has none. Or do we say, what was the principle that Nehemiah was trying to communicate? Because here's the thing, very few of you are paid for your muscles anymore. You're paid daily for what's upstairs. Sit at a desk, maybe in front of a computer. A lot of stuff that you're now paid for is upstairs. And so we need to start thinking about, what does this look like in 2017? And here's one of the big challenges. A lot of us are not carrying physical loads. We're carrying emotional loads, work stress. And how do we start shutting the gates on carrying those emotional loads with us on Sabbath? I think one of the ways is this, Exodus 23:12. 6 days do you work, but on the seventh day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may nuach. Can you believe that? God's saying, hey, you know what? Your ox and donkey get nuach. And such a slave born in your household and a foreigner living among you may be refreshed. This is a passage that we often overlook because a lot of our Sabbath keeping is very narcissistic. If you listen to how people describe the Sabbath, it's in narcissistic terms. It's all about me. I am blessed by Sabbath rest. I am so glad when Sabbath comes around. You notice who the focus is? And yet fully half of the Old Testament passages that talk about Sabbath talk about you dispensing Sabbath to others around you. But we don't usually preach that. We usually preach about it in very narcissistic ways where it's all about you. I hate to tell you this, it's not. And I think that's another evangelistic tool. If we were to start saying it's not just about me, it's about we. How do we as a church start dispensing Sabbath to those around us? Maybe it's the young mother who comes in and she's got 2 kids in tow. I got to tell you, if she has 2 young ones, from my experience in pastoring, it is really, really tough to keep them in church. Because if she's trying to keep 2 young ones in church, at some point she's going, I'm not getting anything out of this. So why even stay? I'm going home. That is one good example of somebody we could give nuach, dispense nuach to in a very practical way. Allow her to experience the nuach. Here's some other ways. I want to introduce you to another concept here. Going back to our Nehemiah thing. We will oftentimes the mental loads we're given is emotional bricks to people around us. And here's some of the ways we give emotional bricks to people. I don't have to tell you about criticism. That kind of goes without saying. Getting to church. Did you know that just getting to church, I did a survey with my church as part of my doctoral work. Did you know the number one thing, stressor for people on Sabbath morning, was getting to church? Think about it. If you got young kids, trying to get them dressed, and if you were driving this morning through the crazy rain and hydroplaning, that also adds maybe to your heartbeat a little bit. You know what I'm talking about. And so even before people walk in our doors, they're already feeling stressed. Intrusive questions. I kid you not. People ask, Art Linkletter had a show, said kids say the darndest things. Adults do too. I remember my mom sharing with me, when she and my father were divorcing, people at church would say, "So how's the divorce going?" You know? I made a mistake. One of my elders at a previous church, it's potluck. You're kind of looking for things to say. It's kind of small talk. "So how's work going?" And he gets this look on his face. "Oh, man, I got a new boss this week. And she's just been riding us." Where did I take his mind? I took his mind straight out of Nuach and right back into a stressful work week that he'd been having. I didn't intend to, but it's so easy to do that to each other. And so I think we've got to be intelligent about how we're doing this. And that's why dispensing Nuach, we have to get intelligent, to get smart about how we dispense Nuach and not just say crazy things out there, not because it doesn't impact me. I got to take some ownership of what I say to people. Poorly run AV. Hey, thanks, guys. You're doing a great job up there, by the way. But I've been in churches where it wasn't run that well. And it is stressful not only for the speaker, it is stressful for the congregation as well. And that was shown up on my survey. If we don't have a good mother's room or something like that, when children get really noisy, that can be stressful for some people. Non-Nuach talk. We start talking about sports teams and everything else, stuff that takes us out of the Nuach environment. Church conflict, I don't even have to tell you about that. Negative people. And let me just say something about criticism. A lot of times we cut ourselves a lot of slack when we say it's constructive criticism, as if that makes it okay. A number of years ago in a different church, I had a retired pastor there. And I was a younger pastor, and here's the inside secret. Sometimes when we hear a really good sermon somewhere, and we think our churches back home are not going to hear that same sermon, we'll start borrowing pieces from it. Sometimes we'll borrow wholesale. And I'd been at camp meeting, and the former editor of the Review, Bill Johnson, had done a really interesting sermon. And so I will confess, I got the tape, and I dictated really well. And I preached it. And this pastor at the door sees me, this retired pastor. His comment was to me at the door, "Can you preach a biblical sermon?" Okay, I have pretty good self-esteem. It didn't hurt my self-esteem. It just made me mad. Because I'm thinking, how rude. It's like, and I already started working on this thing years ago about in the Sabbath environment. So I said, let's talk on Monday. But for the rest of that Sabbath, I'm thinking, what's he doing? He, of all people, should be not ambushing me at the door. I would expect that from somebody else, but from a pastor to come and ambush me at the door with that kind of comment, what's he doing? And I'm trying to bring myself back into the Nuach environment. Negative people. If you're always only talking about the negative stuff, I got to tell you, I had a church treasurer at one church. And if I saw her coming my way and I didn't think she'd seen me yet, I would try to sneak out another way because I did not want to hear about her latest problem that week. She could turn Christmas parties, I kid you not, into how bad the world was. Being an outsider, this is one of the big challenges that all churches have. And this is going to be a challenge for you to fix too. You're an outsider if you're a family church, but you're single. You're an outsider if you want to have kids and you don't. It can feel like that. You have a school, you talk about school age and stuff like that. What if your kids aren't going to the school? What if your first language isn't English? I could go on and on. What if you don't have the same friends as somebody else, the same connections? There are so many different ways that you're an outsider. And I think one of the beauty of the churches is that we try to envelop. You need to be aware that this is one of the most stressful things for people is when they come to church and they feel like an outsider. And so I'm just letting you know this could be something you need to work on. Because it's always an issue. Introversion. A lot of times we design our churches, and thank you for not doing this morning, we design our churches to be a non-alcoholic cocktail party. We believe that the more social you are, the more religious and spiritual you are. Do you know what the number one thing that guests hate with churches? You're shaking your head. Exactly. Number one. Your guests hate it. They do not think it's friendly when you say, stand up and turn around and greet somebody. Now, if you're an extrovert like me, you're going, hey, this is fun. If you're an introvert like my wife, you're going to shoot me now. I did a survey at my church because we were doing this. And it was before I saw another research thing that somebody had done. But it came back in my research too, my church survey. And I'm asking my elders. I'm going, really? And I'm trying to figure it out. And you'd think I was at an AA meeting. Because at first, everybody's just quiet. And then pretty soon, one of them is almost like he said, well, my name is Nathan, and I really hate this time. One by one, they start going around. I stay outside until it's over. Another one says, that's usually when I go refill my water bottle. And I realized I had a bunch of introverted elders. But you have to keep in mind that spirituality is not just for the social-minded amongst us. We have to be aware of introversion, and some of the things that we do on Sabbath morning is really stressful to the introverts amongst us. How do we help these individuals? And I'm going to encourage you not to ignore these issues I just mentioned. There's another big one out there too, that sometimes with our young people that is really, really impacting them. And that is they're not able to get away from social media. Nora Cardin, 17, says she's relieved when she goes on a trip that requires her to leave her phone for a while. There's actually online, if you go and look up Google like Sabbath Manifesto, they will send you a Sabbath sleeping bag for your cell phone. And maybe that's something we need to start thinking about. And I got to tell you, I'm as hooked on my cell phone as you are. And I'm preaching this. And I'm thinking, even last night, I'm thinking, you want to bring out your cell phone? We're so hooked on this little thing in front of us. We don't realize it's causing us stress too. And especially for our teens, they're so involved with social media, they're not getting away from it. And you know what happens on social media. There's bullying. But even on Facebook, we don't put the worst side of us on Facebook. We're always putting the best side. Here's my fantastic vacation. Here's my latest great accomplishment. And if we're not careful, we start thinking that's reality. That's the whole picture. And so at the end of the day, we need to learn to unplug. Here's some individuals who are saying they unplug. This one says, I unplug to reflect. I unplug to spend time with my family. I unplug to be mindful. I unplug to be present. I unplug to hear God's voice. I'll leave you with one last thing here. Much church activity is unfortunately geared to make us even busier on Sundays. And this book, by the way, is fantastic about stress. He talks about Sabbath, but he's calling it Sunday. And I believe this can be a pitfall. If you're not slowing down significantly on your day of rest, you're going against God's intent as well as courting stress damage. I'm going to confess something. As a pastor, it's very easy for me to come to church, preach, and not worship. Very easy. Because I'm so focused on my sermon, and going back to that stress thing, I have to force myself to be present. Present during the music, present during the prayer. And if you ask the worship leaders, they'll probably tell you the same thing. That we are so focused on leading worship, we fail to worship ourselves. And if you are having a ton of busy stuff on Sabbath, and I'm not saying it's all wrong, but if we're not careful, we can make our Sabbath so busy that we're not slowing down too. Perhaps one of the greatest ironies of history, Andersonville prison camp, Confederate Army. Over 13,000 Union soldiers died there. That's twice as many that have died in Iraq and Afghanistan. 13,000. And the cruel history was they're dying, a lot of them, disease, a lot of it caused from dysentery. If they could have dealt with dysentery, most of them a lot of them could have survived. Here's the cruel irony of history. Underneath them, a few feet underneath them, the clay of Andersonville is one of the world's largest deposits of kaolin. Kaolin is known to curb the effects of dysentery. Now, maybe you've never heard of kaolin, but you know its commercial name. Kaopectate. Right underneath them was the thing that could have been saving their life. And so right now, I got to call you to worship. I got to call you to worship the God who created you, who knows you so well that he said you have to have Nuach. Not only for your well-being because of the craziness that's in your world, but that you have to have Nuach so that when you come in these doors and you can worship, you can push those things aside. Say, God, here I am to worship. Hebrews 4:9-11. There then remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest. May you experience God's incredible Nuach. And just as importantly, may you be a channel for that Nuach to those around you.